Everybody. We are going to review an assault case today, and I'm going to go over the different things that forensic nurses look for when reviewing assault cases. And in this case, we're actually going to look at a actual case, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the legal things that nurses need to consider when reviewing them. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Tara Godoy, and I am a forensic nurse. I have been doing forensic consulting since 2009 when I opened up Godoy Medical Forensics. I currently have 17 nurses that work for me. This is a photo from a retreat that we did, and obviously it's not everybody, but I just wanted to show that we have a great team and we have a great time. And so most of these are the nurses over here on the left side of the screen. That's me down there in the corner. And then I also have office staff. This is 3 of my 4 office staff that helps us get all the cases in and off to the experts and reports out to the attorneys and things like that. So Godoy Medical Forensics is my main company. That's my consulting firm in which I employ forensic nurses to provide consulting and expert testimony. And then I also have Cadencia for Nurses, which is a mentoring and coaching program for nurses that want to do legal nurse consulting or forensic nurse consulting. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the video. But just to give you an idea, my background's emergency and trauma. I worked at Stanford for several years prior to starting the business. And then I started the business in 2009, grew it to the point where it is now. Last year we grew 55%, so that was in 2021. We grew 55%. We have over 1,200 clients, and right now, as of the end of the fourth quarter of 2022, our average is 32 cases a month. We've consulted on over 2,000 cases through the course of the 13 years. And so I have a vast amount of experience with forensic nursing, and the case that we're going to talk about today was actually my very first case. So let me tell you a little bit about the case before we kind of get into it. I'm going to give you the background. So it was an assault case that was associated with gang violence. There was one group on one side of the street, another group on the other side of the street. They started yelling at each other. Eventually they meet in the middle, and the victim in this case, the complaining witness in this case, ends up getting hit in the back of the head by the main defendant in the case, and then the co-defendants, who were the remaining gang members, started kicking and hitting him once he was on the ground. So in this particular case, I was actually hired by the attorney for one of the co-defendants who was responsible, along with his other co-defendants, for kicking and hitting him once he was on the ground, and that was a really important differentiation, which I'll talk about. And then the last thing I want to point out is that there was differing witness accounts, which always is the case. But what was important in this particular case is some witnesses said that he lost consciousness before he fell. So right after the blow to his head, he lost consciousness, fell to the ground. Some say that he was conscious when he hit the ground and lost consciousness afterwards. And when an attorney, there's different things that attorneys will look for in assault cases, but one of the things that they will look for, one of the things that attorneys will look for in assault cases is the role that their particular client played versus maybe the co-defendants or the defendant, depending on who they are representing. And they're also going to want to know the severity of injuries. And one of the things that they will look for is the severity of bodily injuries. There's different terms. GBI is great bodily injury. And GBI is a specific term used in California, whereas other states use serious or significant bodily injury or some version of that type of terminology. But basically every state's going to have some version of bodily injury. And I would recommend that you actually look up the definition in your state, because that is something that in a lot of the cases, in a lot of the criminal cases, you're going to want to know what the criteria is, because it's different in every case. So in California, great bodily injury is significant or substantial physical injury, injury that is greater than minor or moderate harm. So as you can see, this is a very vague, non-specific term that can be used very broadly, and the person that is deciding has a lot of room for determining what that definition means. Now, the other two, serious and significant bodily injury, because there's multiple states that use it, what I've done is I've compiled different definitions from different states. And so this isn't one specific state. It's basically kind of a composite of what those states the state that uses that might use something similar to this. So serious bodily injury is bodily injury that creates or causes serious permanent disfigurement. And, just looking at that permanent disfigurement, what does that mean? Well, I pulled up the definition, or one of the definitions, and it's basically a permanent change in the person's body. And so one of the things that comes up with permanent disfigurement is scarring. And whether or not that scarring meets the level of serious bodily injury is also up to the person that's deciding, because, say that if the person has a scar that's relatively small underneath their hair, like where you can't see it, versus a fairly large scar or even a small scar on your face, there's going to be a different level of disfigurement that is seen in those types of things. And then the last one, significant bodily injury, is an injury that requires hospitalization or immediate medical attention. And this seems like a pretty low threshold to me, because you can have a bloody nose and need immediate medical attention. And I'm not sure that really constitutes significant bodily injury. But one of the things, really to keep in mind, these are legal definitions, GBI and SBI both. Those are legal definitions, and therefore, as forensic nurses, we cannot provide an opinion as to whether or not it meets the criteria of bodily injury. We are not legal, we are not attorneys, that's not our job. And so what we do as forensic nurses is we're going to educate the jury and educate the attorneys as to what the severity of the injuries are, what they are, and let them come to the determination of whether or not bodily injury has been met per the state's criteria. So when you're testifying related to bodily injury, there's about 5 different areas in which you might testify in relationship to that. And so I've done a little kind of cross comparison here. And so what the injuries are, that's going to be a definition of explaining what the relevant anatomy is, defining what it is. Basically, it's just a flat out, what does that mean type definition. And then severity, you're going to talk about the risk of death, disability, or disfigurement, and that's probably the one that's most directly related to the bodily injury. But other things that might come up in assault cases is the mechanism. How did this injury occur? What does it match up with the story that's being told? Does it match up to the witness accounts? And is the person being charged with the appropriate, if the injury is a component of their charges, is it something that matches up with what they were accused of doing? Mitigating factors might be related to underlying health conditions, patient compliance, their own willingness to follow up with their doctors or the care that's being recommended for them, stuff like physical therapy, taking medications, all that can be a mitigating factor. And then the treatment prognosis. So these are the expected outcome. And this goes back to the severity of the injury as well, because if it's something where it's going to take them an extended period of time to return to their normal level of function, then that goes to the severity of the injury as well. So when you first start reviewing an assault case or reviewing really any kind of criminal case, you're going to want to start with the police reports. And that's what I've already given you in terms of the case facts. But one thing to keep in mind is when you talk to the attorney, they're going to give you their version of the events, and you want to make sure that you review the police reports to ensure that their version of events is what's actually represented in the police reports. And oftentimes there's things in the police reports that you may pick up on that they don't necessarily know to look for, like the witness accounts related to the loss of consciousness. An attorney may not realize that there may be a difference between when that person loses consciousness. And then in terms of the order of things, I oftentimes will start with the EMS reports or the emergency department reports once I'm digging into the medical records. And so as I'm going through this, you don't necessarily have to go in this order. These are just the things that I look for in these particular records. So in the EMS reports, one of the things I look for is times, because one of the mitigating factors can be prolonged response time, a prolonged extrication time, prolonged transport time, and all of that relates to the outcome of the patient, because you want to get that immediate emergency care delivered as promptly as possible, so that the outcome of the patient is, is better based off of the amount of time it takes to get to that level of care. So looking at the EMS reports for times is important. And then also looking at the EMS reports for their narrative. And one of the things you have to keep in mind is that the paramedics and EMTs and firefighters, they're the first medically trained of any kind personnel on the scene. And so I've had cases where a police officer documented that the victim in the case had a hematoma to his forehead, and he gets to the emergency department and they wipe off the dirt. There was no hematoma, there was no bruise. It was literally just a smudge of dirt on the forehead that was mislabeled by the police officers. And so having that first perspective of somebody that's trained medically can be really important in the case. So in these notes, don't worry that you can't read them. I should have said that on the last slide. These were old. This was my very first case back in 2009. So the records were pretty bad. I had to ask for the EMS report several times before I got a version that I could actually read. But what you want to know out of this is that the paramedics entered the scene to find an A&O times 3 18-year-old male lying supine on the street, and he did not recall the event. And so one of the things you want to look for is loss of consciousness in any case, because loss of consciousness may in and of itself constitute bodily injury. And just somebody reporting that he lost consciousness, like the witness accounts, is not really sufficient. You want to look for the patient's accounts to make sure that there's an indication of a lapse in memory that supports that loss of consciousness. Also, if you think about it, him lying supine on the street curb, if he was hit in the back of the head and he lost consciousness, then he would fall face forward. And if he would either, like if he had lost consciousness, he would fall face forward, and you would expect him to have some kind of frontal injuries because he didn't block his fall. Or if he was still conscious, he may block his fall, but still he would be face forward. And we know that he lost consciousness. So him lying supine on the street curb tells me that he likely either woke up and rolled over, or somebody rolled him over. And that's something that, it kind of goes towards the timeline of the events. And then the last thing on the EMS reports that you really want to look for, or what I was looking for in this particular case, was soft tissue injuries. Was there a facial, was there nasal fracture or even abrasion on the head? Was there a hematoma? Anything along those lines. And also throughout the rest of his body, because remember, the co-defendants in this case, which were represented by the attorney that hired me, they were kicking and hitting him. And so I was looking for indications of abrasions or lacerations or hematomas elsewhere on the body, signs, indication that there may be an underlying fracture, things like that. And in this case, there really was not much, outside. There was no external injuries, or very few external injuries. And then when you look at the emergency department records, one of the things to pay attention to is whether or not you have the initial emergency department records. So in this case, he was admitted to one emergency department, determined that he had a traumatic brain injury that we're going to talk about in a second. And then he was transferred to a second emergency department because the first hospital did not have neurosurgery. And so this is, you can see that here, patient arrived from, I redacted it. And so one of the things you want to look for is the records from the initial record, or the initial hospital, and also request the facility transfer records, CCT, BLS, ALS, whatever it is, because again, you don't want any lapses in the timeline up until the initial care is being rendered. So you'd go back to the attorney and ask for those missing records, and you want to do it sooner than later because you don't want to cause a delay with missing records. And then also still looking in these records for other injuries such as soft tissue injuries, torso injuries, rib fractures. We're going to see here whether or not there's indication of an underlying rib fracture or other underlying injuries from that kicking and hitting. And then finally, you want to look at the past medical history of the patient, because any underlying conditions may contribute as a mitigating factor, or it could be, in this case, it wasn't, but it's a possibility that this camptodactyly, which is a finger deformity, might be misconstrued by the prosecution as an injury as a result of the assault, because it's a kind of visible trauma and may be seen as something that was there as a result of the assault. And so having it on the history of camptodactyly of something that he had previously is something that can be really important. Now, in this case, as I mentioned, we've got traumatic brain injury, so I think we've met the level of bodily injury. Most likely the jury's going to find for that, depending on, the traumatic brain injury of what it is. But if we didn't have that, they might see, a finger deformity that's somewhat permanent as a permanent disfigurement, right? And then, building the timeline, I'm going through the physical exam, and we're seeing here that by the time he gets to the second hospital, he's intubated, not following commands. He's got pupillary changes. He's obviously got some neurological deterioration. And so we're seeing, the progression of his injuries and that traumatic brain injury affecting his neurological status. You always want to look at the labs because ethanol and drugs, basically the toxicology is going to be one of the more important things that you look at in any criminal case. And you guys may not be aware that 323 milligrams per deciliter is the equivalent of 0.323. So you're going to move that decimal point over 3 spots, and so it's about 4 times the legal limit. And then that leads us into a discussion of what role does alcohol play in criminal cases? And what, I want you to think about is not only kind of the mental status of the ability to remember things, the ability to articulate things, but there are certain cases in which maybe there's an alleged assault, but the only people that were there was the complaining witness and the defendant. And the defendant says, hey, he fell, he was drunk, he fell, that's how he got that injury. And if they were intoxicated, they're at higher risk for falling. And so that's something where you want to look at the injuries and say, is it consistent with falling, or is it more consistent with whatever the injuries are being alleged as a part of the assault? And then the last thing about alcohol is it does have mild blood thinning properties. And so in terms of a mitigating factor, you're not going to spontaneously have a traumatic brain injury unless you have an underlying cerebral vascular issue. But if you do have an intracranial bleed, it might be worse as a result of being intoxicated. And that's something that your attorney is going to want to be aware of. And then the discharge summary is going to be particularly important because then we've got all the tests run, we know what the injuries are. So in this case, we have a couple different things to look at. First of all, the length of stay. So he was there for 19 days, which goes into the severity of the injury. It obviously meant that it was not a simple care that was rendered to him. You want to pay attention to the fact that it's a transfer summary, which means that he didn't go home, which also goes to the severity of the injury. And you also may want to look for the records of whatever facility that he went to. Now, that's really dependent on your own review. You don't necessarily need those. And in fact, probably in most cases you don't, because really what you're looking for is what the injuries were. And then, if there's something where you feel like it's longer term than even, maybe it's a permanent like brain damage type situation, that's a situation where you might want to get the records where he was discharged to. But a lot of times it's an unnecessary expense to have you review those additional records when you have the answers that you need from the hospitalization. And then, of course, you want to look at the reason for admission. And so this is where, we find out that he's got a holohemispheric subdural hematoma and a right frontal contusion, and he had a hemicraniectomy. So definitely the main defendant in this case, who was the likely cause of the traumatic brain injury, we've got some serious injuries here. But one thing that was really interesting to me was that right frontal contusion. So if he gets hit in the back of the head and he falls forward, if he broke his fall, he probably would not necessarily have that frontal contusion. Whereas if he fell and hit the ground and his brain comes flying forward in his skull, that's where, more than likely he lost consciousness from that initial blow. But either way, the initial blow, whether it's the blow itself that caused the subdural hematoma, or whether it's from him hitting the ground and the subdural hematoma from that secondary impact, either one of those is directly tied to that blow to the back of the head, and therefore the main defendant in the case is going to be responsible for that. As I mentioned before, when I was going through the records, the EMS records and the ER records and the discharge summary, there were basically no other injuries that would be correlated with the co-defendants who were kicking and hitting him, causing that traumatic brain injury. So now if there was like a facial fracture or even a fairly significant laceration on the face, then there may be some argument there that could be equally likely to cause the traumatic brain injury. But given the lack of facial injuries, soft tissue, underlying fractures, and the witness account saying that he fell as soon as he got hit in the back of the head, I was able to educate the attorney to say that the most likely, there's never anything 100% in medicine, but most likely the traumatic brain injury came from that blow to the back of the head. And so that was a really significant finding, and the frontal contusion definitely helped with determining when that traumatic brain injury occurred. And then also on the discharge, you want to look at the consultants, who was playing a role. Sometimes you're going to want to go back and find these reports, see what they had to say, just at least review quickly and get an idea of what the severity of the neurological status was, how much therapy was needed, but also paying attention to how he was when he left. So he's still got some neurological compromise here, and stuff that may be permanent. And then this, of course, is where you're going to find where he went to, and you're going to look for those records. So, in summary, in terms of the assault case, what ended up happening was the co-defendants were being charged with attempted murder, along with the defendant. All of them were being charged with attempted murder. Now, the injuries were sufficient that the main defendant in the case that caused the traumatic brain injury, those, met the level that were likely to be attempted murder. But the kicking and hitting, because there was really no underlying injuries and certainly no life-threatening injuries from kicking and hitting him once he was on the ground, I was able to educate the attorney that that was unlikely. There was really no great bodily injury. And so he was able to, the outcome in this case was that the charges were dropped to assault instead of attempted murder, which is still a very serious charge, but considering that the person was a juvenile, it was very good that he kind of, lessened the charge, no great bodily injury, and therefore no strike. And so when you're reviewing the case, make sure you talk to the attorney and know what they are looking for, because every case is different in what is important to them. And you don't necessarily need to look for, deep into the records. You don't have to review the entire chart. You want to do a focused review, and then, you talk to the attorney again, and maybe you'll be looking for additional records. But for the most part, you're not responsible for reviewing the entire chart. And then watching for mitigating factors as you're doing the review, like the past medical history. You definitely want to look for breaches in the standard of care, although that is not the focus on criminal cases. They can be mitigating factors if it causes a poorer prognosis or a poorer outcome because of the breaches in the standard of care, and interference such as like a prolonged extrication or something where there's, the responses aren't what we're expecting. So for those of you that are legal nurse consultants and either just starting out, or if you already have a civil practice, or maybe you've even done a couple criminal cases, I've designed Carencia for Nurses because I wanted to create a program where people can get mentored at any stage in their legal nurse consulting career path. And I wanted to create a program that makes people feel like it's a community environment. And so really what I've done is I've made myself available for one-to-one mentoring outside of my own business. I've got group coaching, and I've got kind of beginner modules for those of you that have not done a training yet. And so just to talk about those, so first the modules. So if you're a pretty new nurse if you're pretty new getting into legal nurse consulting, I recommend that you do the go at your own pace modules. For those of you that have already done a training, there's a lot of redundancy in this. So I don't necessarily recommend it to somebody that's already done some kind of training. But in the modules, I cover the criminal forensic nursing, I cover civil legal nurse consulting, and then I also cover business and marketing, which some people that even have done a training may find benefit in because the criminal and business and marketing oftentimes may not be covered in every other training program. So if that's something that appeals to you, that is a live program. It's up and running, and you can go to CarenciaForNurses.com and sign up for that program at any time. The group coaching is currently waitlisted, and so if you are interested in doing that, you would also go to CarenciaForNurses.com, and there's a link to the group coaching waitlist form. It's just a Google form, and so there's no obligation at this time. It's really just to be notified when we launch the next program. And what the group coaching is it's 6 months, 6 cases. And what I've done is I've picked 6 cases that I think are well suited for nurses that do not have necessarily an emergency or trauma background. This is for any nurse with any kind of background. There's 3 DUI cases and 3 assault cases. And so you're really going to get a perspective of the different types of things that we are looking for in those 2 different types of cases. And it's really designed to help you know what to look for. Now you will have sample cases, that you'll have actual cases that have been redacted for the review, and you are welcome to use those as sample cases for written reports as well. And then, the one-to-one mentoring, we can pretty much cover anything that you want to cover. So if you wanted to write up a report on one of those group coaching cases, then that's something that I could help you give you feedback on the written report. Say you've got a criminal case and you just want somebody to help walk you through it. That's another possibility. If you want to, help on the business or marketing side, if you want to help getting more clients, building your business out. Say you're not interested in forensic nursing at all. That's where really all the one-to-one mentoring comes in. And then we do have a community, which is really it comes with the go at your own pace modules and the group coaching. And it's a community that is, again, designed for networking. It's designed for helping, positivity, support, all that kind of stuff. And then last but not least, of course, is our social media and our newsletter. If you have not yet, please sign up for our newsletter. If you go to Carencia for Nurses, you'll scroll to the bottom and be able to put your email address in. And I highly recommend that you do that, because when we launch new, like the forensic group coaching, when we launch discounts, and then I also do, the monthly newsletter that has information on civil and criminal legal nurse consulting, and a lot of it is focused on the forensics, and so you'll see a lot of information there about forensic nursing. And but join the group, connect with me on LinkedIn, and then there's also I have free 15-minute consultations if you want to ask me questions about the program, or if you just want to learn more about forensic nursing and whether or not it's the right place for you. I have that, and so just reach out to me in one of those social media, either LinkedIn or Facebook, and I'm happy to send you the information on how to get that free 15-minute consult.